Our New Testament lesson comes from the 12th chapter of the letter written to the Hebrews, beginning at the first verse. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as children. My child, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, or lose heart when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines those whom he loves, and chastises every child whom he accepts. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of the word. Let us pray. Almighty God, we pray that you'd open our hearts and our minds, that not only would we be hearers of your word, but that we would also be doers of your word. Amen. As we are here at the time of All Saints' Day, we are reminding ourselves that we are never alone. Even if we find ourselves stranded somewhere, even if we think we're the only person in the whole world, you can be in a crowd and still feel lost and alone. But we are not lost and alone, because we always have the spirit of those who have gone before. And as already been said here, every person that we met changes us. And not just changes us, but changes us forever. We can never be the same once we have met someone. And so often we forget to go back and to look at what is obvious and right before us. That this is a great source of comfort for us that we often don't use. We don't say, oh, I remember the saints of the past. I remember Rebecca. I remember King David. I remember Paul. I remember all the other saints of Deborah and all the prophets and all that. I'm going to do the things that they did, and I think this is going to change things. But we should. We have so much time. We have tunnel vision that, they say that we can lose the forest by looking right at a tree, but we can lose the tree by just looking at the forest as well. It was amazing. I was going through Googling everything I could to try to find some kind of illustration that I was satisfied with for this kind of a thing. And I ran into someone who has been doing a lot of research about the sinking of the Titanic. And and this person also is a leader in motivational speaking and in industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And his premise is that we are so focused on what something is supposed to do that we don't see the possibilities that it has to do. And that's true. We look at something, we look at a screwdriver and we say, you can turn in a screw with it. But what are the other possibilities? Well, I could put it in a steak and pick it up off the barbecue if I want to. You might not think you want to do that, but you could if you wanted to. It's not just a screwdriver, it's a steak remover. But he's going on talking about the Titanic. And I'm thinking, I wonder what he's really getting at here. Now, his premise is that there didn't have to be that many deaths on the Titanic. That after they ran into the iceberg, they didn't have enough of their lifeboats. They still could, even under limited circumstances, still maneuver the ship. And if they had maneuvered the ship alongside the iceberg, and the able-bodied men and women who could do this could climb onto the iceberg, there is a 400 to 500 foot long, a 200 foot wide floating vessel. And the iceberg is never going to sink. And then there would have been more lifeboats for other people to take. But no one seemed to look at the iceberg as something that could rescue them. They look at something that sank them. Now, I don't know how plausible that was and how much maneuvering it would take, but I think the man's got a point. And so often we don't look back at all the accomplishments. We look at things that haven't got done. We look at things we did and it didn't work out the way we wanted it to work out. But what about all of the strength? What about all of the creativity? What about all of the faithfulness and the trust and the hope of all the saints that have gone before us? Can't we take that onto ourselves and use it for ourselves? So in thinking about that, I picked out two, and it's Rebecca, and it's also David, who eventually became king. Now, Rebecca is not one that we generally talk about a lot. A lot of people probably wouldn't know that Rebecca was Isaac's wife. But the story, as it goes, was that Abraham was looking for a bride for his son Isaac. He didn't want just any bride. He wanted a perfect bride. He wanted someone who was good enough for Isaac. He wanted the bride to come from his home country. Now, I'll mention here that the name Isaac is special to Shirley, because that is grandson Isaac, the first of her grandchildren. And I'm sure that she would argue, for someone named Isaac, there's never anybody good enough, because that's the way grandmothers do those things. But Abraham was sure if they go back to the homeland, they would find someone that is good enough for Isaac. It couldn't be a foreigner, and it had to be someone from the homeland. Going to begin a new nation, we need that for Isaac. So he says to his servants, he says, I want you to take these camels and go. We're going to load you with all kinds of jewels and junk and stuff and gold. And you go find this bride. And when you find her, you bring her back, and we'll have her to marry Isaac. So the servant goes tramping off with the 10 camels. He goes clomping along through the desert, through the brush and through the briars, the brambles, everything. He comes to his homeland, and he's just outside of the village, and there's a well there. And as he's approaching, he's thinking to himself, how am I going to know that this is the right person? What if I pick the wrong person? I mean, Abraham said this is ordained by God. Abraham said that this is the will of God. I don't want to mess with God. So I got to find the right one. Now, what is it going to be? How am I going to decide that? Well, Abraham thinks about this, and he says, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to go sit by the well. And the first woman that comes out and offers me a drink from the well and gives water to the camels, I'll know that this is the sign that this is the one that God has chosen. Wow, that sounds, not only him, but his camels, but let's see how it works out. So he goes and he sits by the well. And here comes Rebecca, tromping out to the well. I don't know how far it was from the village. Usually the well's out a little ways. Usually they come out early in the morning. I don't know what time of day it was, but they come out before the sun gets too hot. But she comes to the well and she sees the servant there. It's a stranger. She never saw him before. And before the stranger could say anything, she says, would you like some water? Well, right away this got the servant's attention, right? This is the big part that he was looking for. And then, not only did she give him water, but without saying another word, she turned and started drawing water for the camels. Wow, that sealed the deal for the servant. He knew nobody in their right mind would come out without being asked, give water to a stranger, and then water the camels. Well, she would have given it to a stranger because that was the way of hospitality. But the camels, that would have been a little different story, to have to haul that water for the camels. Camel going across the distance out there for a whole day's journey. Camel drinks about 20 gallons of water to fill back up. There are 10 camels, that's 200 gallons of water. Can you see this little girl out there running around with a bucket filling a trough of 200 gallons of water? Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The sun's getting hotter and hotter. She's back and forth. Never says a word, just going out there and doing that. And there's the stranger just sitting there. He never says anything. He doesn't say, oh, wow, what a wonderful job you're doing. Why didn't she turn to him and say, why don't you get off your backside and give me a hand with this? But she didn't say that. She just kept doing it. So this reminds me of a saint that is beyond a saint. This is a saint that doesn't mind going that second mile. This is a saint that says, I don't care what chores I have at home. I don't care what I had planned for the rest of the day. I don't care that this is going to take every bit of my energy that I'm going to have. And when I get back to the house, if I ever get back to the house, I'm just going to collapse. Here is a stranger who needs water. Here is his camels who needs water. I'm going to provide it because that would be what God would want me to do. God has called us. God has called us to care for the traveler, the care for the orphan, the care for the stranger, the care for the sick and the lonely, and all those things. She knew that, and she never even stopped. And she was so graciously generous. See, it's one thing to take care of a need. It's one thing to stop the bleeding. But it's a far another to take that person into your personal hospice, to put your arms around and keep them. And not only give them palliative care, though, as a hospice, but to give them healing care on an onward basis. Remember the Good Samaritan who found the man who was robbed and left for dead along the road? Not only did he take him to the inn to give him a place to be, but he told the innkeeper, you take and you give him all the care he needs. I'll be back to pay for all that later. He not only made arrangements for him to stay the night, he made arrangements for him to stay. And he felt responsible to do it. That is what the saints of the past have done. This is, we go through the scriptures, we go back, we can see all these things. This is how we find our blessings. It's amazing the joy that someone can feel out of giving of themselves, how we can take ourselves away from our own pain, how we can get out of our own worrying about things that will maybe never happen, and even if they do, worry does nothing for them. But investing ourselves into others. There's also a word of prophecy here too, I think. If we really think what was going on. We have a well. A well's full of water. We cannot live without water. Water is living water. We have someone who has come to the well to draw this water for the stranger. The stranger who is not back in his home village, who is not anywhere near where there is a temple or a synagogue or anything, and she gave him the living water. She took the living water to the people. God does not live just in a temple. God does not live just in a church. God lives within the people. And there is the sign. I am bringing to you the living water of God. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ has done for us. Jesus said, come out of the temple, come to me. If you have a heavy burden, I will make it light. I will give you the abundant, the gracious, living water. So I think it's powerful that we have that within inside. And the saints from there on have done the same things. And that is our job now, to take the living water to the people. It doesn't matter what building we are in. Oh, I wonder why I said that. It doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It matters who we are, not where we are. That's what makes the difference. Well, I think that's pretty powerful, actually. But let's move on to David. David's a fantastic example. David, the little shepherd boy. And I'm going back to a time when David was out in the field and he was going through his duties as a shepherd, and that would have been in 1 Samuel 16. If you go back and read 1 Samuel 16, you'll find out that Samuel, the priest and prophet, was told by God to go anoint a king to replace King Saul. King Saul wasn't doing real well. King Saul was acting kind of weird. King Saul was acting like he has some mental issues going on. But at any rate, Samuel goes out to the house of Jesse. because that's where God had led him to go, to anoint a new king. Well, he had told Jesse, he had sent word, and Jesse was all excited, and he gathered his 7 sons with the exception of David, because David, he wanted him out in the field being the shepherd. And anyway, David was the youngest, David was the smallest, and the least athletic. David would probably rather sing songs than fight battles. David belongs out in the field with the shepherds and the sheep. He does all right out there, but I don't want to, he's not king material. And so Samuel comes, and they line up the 7 sons, and he looks at them, and he says, God doesn't want any of these. Don't you have somebody else? And that's when he went and got David, and they anointed David. Now, if you remember, that was in 1 Samuel 16 and 1 Samuel 17, a little later on. It was David who killed Goliath, the Philistine, who was threatening the entire Israeli army. Wow. This shepherd boy who didn't have the physical abilities, who was the smallest and the weakest, who didn't have this drive for warfare, all of a sudden stood and defeated the entire Philistine army. Sometimes we look at people and we get a wrong opinion of them. We don't give them the right opportunities. We don't put them into our minds as for who they really are. I read about, there was this guy had a daughter, and she was getting engaged. And as any father would do, he wanted to check this guy out. So when they invited the guy for dinner, and after dinner, the father takes the young man into the den. And he says, young man, I know that you're asking my daughter to be engaged to you. How do you propose to buy the kind of ring that she really deserves? And the young man said, well, I'm going to seminary, and I know that God will provide. Well, he said, okay. He said, and you know that once you get married, you're going to have to keep her in a house that she's accustomed to and the kind of lifestyle. He says, well, I don't think I'll be out of seminary, but I know God will provide. Wow. And then finally the man says, someday you'll have children come home. Oh, he says, I'm not really worried about that. I know that once I graduate seminary, everything will be great. I'll be serving God, and God will provide. So they finished up, and the young man went home. The father comes into the kitchen where the wife is putting things away, and the wife says to the father, well, how did your little chat go with the young man? He says, wow. He says, he has no plan. He has no money. He has no resources. But you got to like the kid because he thinks I'm God. Because God's going to provide. So, he knew that was that man's plan. Now, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But he didn't give the young man a chance, because just maybe what the man was thinking, and the man was really saying, I may not look like much to you. I may not have an abundance of wealth. I may not have all the networks that you have and all the places you go with all the great people in the politics and in business and in banking and all those things. I'm just a poor little seminary person who someday is going to go into a little church, and I'm going to do my best to preach out my heart about the love of God. And I just have to believe that whatever happens is God's will, and that God will provide what is really needed, not necessarily what I want. You see? And I think that's the way David was. I don't know what you people are looking for, but I'm going to take my sling and the 5 smooth stones that I just picked up here, and I'm going to go and I'm going to take care of Goliath. I know I can do this because I killed bears and lions and everything else in the field. I know how to do this, even though you don't think I do. And the thing that I think it teaches us from the saints, never allow anyone to put their own limitations on us, and never allow ourselves to feel inadequate. I don't know what we're going to be facing in the future, but I do know that we're not inadequate. I do know that we have the love of God in our heart, and I do know that God will provide. And so I think that's where we are here on All Saints' Day. And we're going to say some prayers, and we're going to light these candles for the saints who have gone on before. They don't have to be a saint who has just passed